So much for joining us. We really appreciate the time that you are taking to join us. Happy Thursday, or as we call it in my house, happy Friday Eve. Thanks so much for joining us. If you could please enable your video, we'd love to see all of your faces. And if you wouldn't mind updating your name to include your title and your state, just hover over those little 3 dots to make the change, and it'll say rename. And then to get a better sense of who is in the Zoom screen, we'd love for you to add to the chat which program you're in. Are you a child welfare fellow or are you an early childhood fellow? We are combining today and we'd love to see what fellowship you are a part of. So a couple of quick housekeeping items. We're recording and we're going to share an archive of the next of this webinar. In the next week or so, we'll be posting this on each of our fellows program pages. Throughout this time today, feel free to ask your question in the chat or raise your hand and unmuting yourself. Feel free to add questions or comments throughout in the chat. And we're also going to have time dedicated afterwards for Q&A once our presentation concludes. So a quick reminder about our fellows. I would encourage you all to get both on the Child Welfare Fellows webpage and the Early Childhood Fellows web pages. So you can get a sense of each of the cohorts, visit, bookmark them. We have pictures of all of you. We also have information from our meeting just a few weeks ago together in Seattle. We'll have the link to this webinar and upcoming information on our meeting mid-September in Denver. So let's jump in. The goals of this time together is to really explore how newborns, infants, and toddlers are doing in states and across the nation. 33% of our children entering foster care are infants and toddlers, which is over twice the percentage of any other age range. We really want you to walk away with additional exposure to a data tool that can inform your policymaking. It is actually really challenging to find out information and really strong data about babies, about newborns, infants, and toddlers. Usually it's kind of clumped together in a birth to 5 range. So this data is really going to dive in. We're also going to be hearing more about 0 to 3's National Infant Toddler Court Program and their new policy framework for strengthening families with infants and toddlers. All right, so as we kick off, let me introduce our 3 0 to 3 presenters and welcome them today. Kim Keating is a senior policy research analyst with 0 to 3. Jacqueline Zom is a senior policy analyst at 0 to 3, and Lindsay Calveri is a parent leader for the National Infant Toddler Court Program. We welcome all of you today, and I am going to hand it off to Kim. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenna, so much for that introduction. And I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. I will start us off very quickly because I know our time is tight and I want you to be able to hear from my colleagues. So we're going to begin with a polling question. And so if you could move to the next slide. All right, so just so that we can start to all think in terms of babies, which we do all day, but maybe not everybody else does. My question is, what unique characteristic or characteristics of infants and toddlers make policy planning for babies so important? And I see the polling question there, and we'll give you time to enter your responses and read through the options.
I see responses pouring in, Kim. We're at about 35%, 43% of folks.
Great.
62. I'll give you guys another second or two to pick an answer that feels right from these few on the screen.
I'm anxious to see the results.
Oh, right. Let's end this and share the results. Do you see them?
I do.
Good.
All right, 79% selected B and D, and you are correct. So the infant toddler years are a period when babies' brains are growing at making 1 million neural connections per second, faster than any other period. And as you all have indicated, this is a period of really strong foundational growth that will affect them for their lifetime going forward. So thank you for participating in the poll. Congratulations to those who got the question right. All right, so next slide. We're going to, I just wanted to give you a very quick background on the yearbook for those who may not already be familiar with it. It does provide holistic information and a view of the nation's babies and families. We do focus very deeply on equity in the yearbook, and wherever possible, report on subgroups of the population of infants and families. So that means by race and ethnicity, by income and urbanicity, so rural or urban location. And we do that to point out the very different experiences of babies and families when you go beyond the national and state level averages that we're so often used to seeing. The yearbook does provide an annual snapshot of how babies are faring, and that's nationally and by state, and that it does include District of Columbia, and this year includes Puerto Rico for the first time. And it's designed to help policymakers and advocates understand how babies are doing, and then use the data to shape policies that help improve outcomes. The data do come from national data sets, such as derivatives from the census. And so I mention this because that means that it's retrospective and doesn't yet reflect the effects of the pandemic. So in the last 2 editions of the yearbook, we were really pleased to be able to include real-time analyses of what families with babies were experiencing during the pandemic, using data that was provided by the University of Oregon's Rabbit Survey project team, which is now based at Stanford. So you'll be seeing some of those results as I go along. Next slide. Within the yearbook itself, we present findings on nearly 60 indicators of well-being and policies in the 3 domains of 0 to 3's policy framework that you see here: good health, strong families, and positive early learning experiences. And then within that, the subdomains of indicators request addressed within each domain, I'm sorry, I'm going to be talking really fast, are outlined here on the slide for you. The largest shares you can see are in our health domain. For today's session, I'll be focusing primarily, as you would expect, on our strong families domain, where the indicators are most relevant to child welfare, but we'll be touching on the other 2 domains as well. Next slide. I also wanted to just point out, if you haven't had a chance to visit our interactive State of Babies yearbook website at stateofbabies.org, we do encourage you to do so and to use it as a resource. I've listed a few of the functions here. I won't read them all out, but most importantly, we hope that you'll review your state profile, where you can interactively explore indicator findings by those subgroups that I just mentioned. Next slide. So to put the findings that I'll be presenting in context, I wanted to first provide a look at some key demographics. The United States is home to 11.4 million babies, representing a little bit more than 3% of the population. More than half of these babies are children of color. And prior to the pandemic, as many as 2 in 5 babies, 40%, lived in families that were either had low income or were living in poverty, meaning these were families that struggled to make ends meet or consistently meet their family's basic needs. Also, 1 in 11, close to 9%, lived in a rural or non-metropolitan area. And I bring this up because this can mean more limited access to healthcare, childcare, and employment resources, depending on the area of the country. In the graph to the right, what I wanted to point out as kind of a precursor was a little bit about intersectionality. The extent to which families have economic stability and access to resources really underlies many of the disparities that will appear in the findings that I'll be sharing with you today. And that chart depicts the intersectionality specifically between race and income to provide you that additional context for reference. Next slide. So we're going to dive into the domains very quickly, starting with the good health domain, where there were 2 indicators that address, if you go back 1 slide, please, where there are 2 indicators that address babies and their parents' social, emotional, and mental health that are particularly important as we talk about child welfare. Okay, next slide. As shown here for mental health, nationally, slightly more than 1 in 5 mothers of babies report less than optimal mental health. The most marked difference that you can see here by race and ethnicity is seen in the lower incidence of Asian mothers reporting poor mental health. And then shown to the far right, where we look at income, mothers with low income, a little bit more than or close to 27%, reported poor mental health at significantly higher rates than those mothers who were above low income, as you might expect. Next slide. These additional charts here for mental health are drawn from the rapid survey data that was collected from parents with babies over the course of the last year, 2021. And if you observe the trend lines here, the peaks and valleys of emotional distress during the year, you can see that as parents' levels of emotional distress increased, they reported similar increases that they were seeing in the stress in their babies. And of course, babies express this in internalizing ways, such as being more withdrawn or disrupted sleeping, or externalizing behaviors like increased fussiness and crying. Next slide. So considering these findings just on mental health, it's promising to see that in our yearbook's policy findings, that the Medicaid plans of most states do recognize the importance of social, emotional, and mental health of babies and their parents. As shown here, a high number of states have plans that cover maternal depression screening during well-child visits. They cover social emotional screening of babies, and also infant and early childhood mental health services that are delivered in the settings that you see here where babies are most likely to be seen. Next slide. So now moving into our strong families domain, and then the next slide. In this domain, I've pulled out indicators that address stressors that parents experience when it comes to meeting their family's basic needs and the material hardship experienced as a result of the pandemic. This slide does include rapid survey findings on the number of families with babies who had experienced a change in household income since the beginning of the pandemic. The focusing on the data at the center of each chart, the top chart related to race and ethnicity, we see in the top chart that in 2021, Black and Latinx parents with young children, the gray and orange circles were most likely to have had reported a decrease in income, and that's higher than the national average of 30%. And then in the lower chart for families with low income, the green circle, they were close to 2 times more likely than families above low income to have had a decrease. And this is important to us because we realize that these losses of household income placed more parents at risk of not being able to meet their own or their children's basic needs. Next slide. I won't spend much time on this. This is similar to the pattern presented earlier, and it just kind of maps specifically for the level of financial hardship and problems that due to financial hardship, the same type of parallel between parent and child emotional distress, which the rapid team refers to as the hardship chain reaction. Next slide. So within this domain, two of the most pronounced indicators of material hardship are food insecurity and babies living in crowded housing. Food insecurity, as you may know, nationally affects approximately 15% of babies and families. And then the findings here show, when you look at this by race and ethnicity, that American Indian, Alaska Native, and Black families with babies experience food insecurity at rates approaching or reaching more than 2 times the national average. And again, these data are prior to the pandemic. What I did want to spend a little bit more time on is crowded housing, which is more relevant for our conversation today. Nationally, also 15% of babies live in crowded housing. But the research tells us that in addition to posing health risks to young children and others, like increased risk of respiratory disease and more frequent injuries, crowding can also have negative effects on how parents relate to their babies. In homes where families are crowded, parents have been found to potentially have fewer opportunities to be adequately responsive to their babies, and that they may be more likely to use punitive discipline. And then you can reflect on the 3 different clusters of demographics that I have at the bottom to see the differences by race, ethnicity, income, and urbanicity, where the differences are less stark. Next slide. So when we talk about childhood adversities, nationally 1 in 5 babies, nearly 20%, has already had one adverse experience in their first 3 years, and 1 in 13 has had 2 or more. Focusing on the chart, what's noticeable here, most notable, is that Black babies were significantly more likely to have had 2 or more experiences, and this followed by Hispanic babies than what we see nationally at closer to 7%. And as shown on the far right, at nearly 13%, babies and families with low income were more than 3 times more likely than the national average to have experienced 2 or more ACEs. In terms of maltreatment rate, nationally, that rate is 15.9 babies per 1,000 children. And this indicator is specific just to children between ages 0 to 2. As stated here, this varies tremendously by state, as you can see in that range there. And as many as 20 states have rates above 20 babies per 1,000 age 0 to 2.
Kim, this is Kind. I'm sorry to jump in. I see we have a hand raised from Representative Carlson. I believe Representative Carlson may have a burning question that she'd like to ask before we move on. Rep. Carlson, please feel free to either type your question to the chat box or unmute yourself.
Thank you. I do just have a quick question on the last slide. Crowded housing was not defined. So I was curious as to what that means.
Thank you for your question. So for crowded housing, that's a specific definition. And what it means from the source is that there are more than two people per room where there are rooms. And in a home where there are no rooms, that, and this is from various families, and in a home where there are no rooms, that there's more than 1 person per room. So thank you. And I'd be happy to follow up with a more specific definition or, more details if you're interested.
No, thank you. That helps. As long as I'm on not mute. I'm not sure that I'm following the labels on the adverse experience chart.
on the prior chart, childhood adversities. And which labels are you in terms of on the chart itself? I can explain the key. The national is the first bar. And then we have the races in the order that they appear: Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white are the groups that the data were available for. And then on the far right, we have the income. So the first bar, the light green bar, as families who have babies and have low income. And then the darker green bar is families above low income. And that would be, for that definition, above 200 percentage points, 200% of the federal poverty level. Does that answer?
It kind of does. So the colors don't mean anything. Like you have a purple bar, but there's no purple key.
Oh, I apologize. That would be.
So I'm just trying to like see which
Order.
one.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just trying to see which which label went to the columns because the colors don't match. So thank you.
I appreciate that. That's a matter of my version control, so I apologize. Thank you for pointing that out. So we were at child welfare involvement. Okay. All right, so our yearbook indicators addressing the experience of babies who enter the child welfare system are shown here. The first one being removals. You see the national rate here of 7.1 babies per 1,000. And then in the chart to the right, you can see the differences, which are substantial by race and ethnicity, with the most marked difference being found among American Indian Alaska Natives, who had a removal rate approximately 3 times the national average. In terms of time and out of placement, approaching 1 in 5 babies achieve permanency in less than 12 months. And this also does differ. In the interest of time, I did not include a graphic, but I encourage you to visit the website or to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to go into the details there for you. Lastly, permanency outcomes, as shown here, reunification is the most frequent outcome for this age group for babies, followed by adoption at approximately 35%. Next slide. So I'm going to close out this domain with a positive indicator, family resilience, which, as you can see, as many as close to 9 in 10 families do report high resilience. This indicator comes from the National Survey of Children's Health and the series of 4 questions that you see there in front of you. To be included in the chart, families would have had to answer yes to all 4 of these questions to have responded at least most of the time or all the time to all 4 items. And so it's pretty encouraging to see that our levels of resilience are high. So to close out really quickly, I'm going to move us to the next slide. I have just a few indicators in positive early learning experiences, which mainly are related to access to care and the cost of childcare, which can present obviously additional family stressors. Next slide. In a majority of states, as shown here, the cost of childcare for infants and toddler care is extremely high and above the suggested limits of no more than 7% of family income. At the same time, few families with low income who could benefit from assistance, such as through CCDF subsidy funding, actually receive it due to inadequate funding. And on our next slide, we see a similar result in terms of early Head Start, where for families in poverty, just slightly more than 1 in 10 babies in poverty actually are reached by the Early Head Start program. So for my final slide, I have listed out for you several responsive policy options that we report on in the yearbook that can address several of the challenges that I've outlined. And we'll be moving now to the last of the policies that I have indicated here to implementing family strengthening child welfare systems. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jacqueline. And thank you so much.
Hi, this is Kine again. Just before we have Jacqueline start, I see we have one hand up from Senator Favola. Senator, if you have a quicker burning question for Kim, it looks like she put the question into the chat box. We will have dedicated time for Q&A for all our speakers at the end. So please feel free to put your questions in there and we'll get to them. But if you have, a clarifying or burning question as Representative Carlson did, then we will get to your question.
So we can hold my question if you wish to the end. Is that your desire?
Great, yes.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Next slide, please. One more. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Zram, and I work on policy and sustainability with the National Infant Toddler Core Program at 0 to 3. And I want to echo Kim and thank NCSL for inviting us here today to talk about our work. Next slide. I just want to note our supporters, the ITCP, as we call ourselves, is supported by the Health Resources and Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the Balmer Group. Next slide, please. To give you a bit of background on this program, the ITCP is operated by 0 to 3, as well as our partners, the American Bar Association, the Center for the Study of Social Policy, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and RTI International. And the ITCP supports the implementation of the Safe Babies Court Team approach. So court teams work with families of infants and toddlers who are under the court's jurisdiction and either in or at risk of entering the child welfare system. And the aim of our program is to apply the science of early childhood development to meet the needs of young children and their families so they can thrive. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to show quickly where we have court teams. We are in more than 100 local sites and that are located in 30 states across the country. And all of these sites are at different levels of implementation of their court team. And we have 7 states that are implementing the Safe Babies Court Team approach statewide throughout the state. Next slide. Before I begin talking about our new resource, I wanted to start with a poll question. And how many states do you think had an increase in the rate of infants, so children under 1, who were entering foster care from 2011 to 2018? So either less than 10 states, 15 states, 30 states, or more than 40. And hopefully you can see poll question up on your screen. And just take your best guess. And just to give some background, this data comes from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Jacqueline, it looks like we've got about 83% of participants having responded.
That sounds great.
All right, I'm going to end this, show it to you all. Do you see the results?
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for participating. And the correct answer is actually D, more than 40 states. It's actually 44 states. So, as I mentioned, this report from HHS came out at the end of last year, titled that foster care entry rates grew faster for infants than for children of other ages. And this report looked at data reported by all the states and found that the increase in foster care entry of infants accounted for 70% of the total increase in foster care entries for all age groups. And as I said, it's 44 states had an increase in infants' rate of entry into care with a wide range of increases. And I just wanted to have this poll on here to keep at the top of our minds the importance of understanding the needs of families with babies and the importance of connection during those earliest years. Next slide, please. So we heard from Kim about a lot of the important data from the 0 to 3 SOBI report, and I wanted to give a bit of national perspective on children entering foster care. And we heard Jenna introduce earlier that infants and toddlers, so children under 3, are the largest group of children entering care compared to all other age groups. And I think this pie chart is helpful so you can see the blue piece of the pie, that 33% of children entering foster care are under 3 as compared to the other age groups. And you can probably guess from our previous poll question that infants, so children under 1, make up the biggest piece of that 33%. And at the National ITCP, we focus on prioritizing strength-based approaches and strengthening protective factors for families with babies and toddlers, working to build the strength of the communities in which families live and grow to prevent young children from having to be removed from their family. Next slide, please. I want to give a quick context for why we created a new ITCP policy framework. In 2013, 0 to 3 worked with Child Trends, another national nonprofit, to develop a survey that we did in 2013 and again in 2019, looking at the extent to which states had policies and, just as importantly, practices addressing the needs of infants and toddlers and their families in the child welfare system. 2 key findings from that report were that there were few states that have policies or practices that differentiate services or timelines for infants and toddlers in child welfare versus those for older children whose needs are markedly different than the needs of babies. The other finding was that relatively few states were implementing approaches to meet the unique developmental needs of infants and toddlers. So when we conducted the follow-up survey in 2019, we found that there were still significant gaps in how state child welfare practices were supporting the needs of infants and toddlers and their families. And a significant finding of this 2019 survey was also that states were consistently less likely to offer supports to families who were at risk of entering foster care versus families whose infants and toddlers were currently in foster care. So this survey provided some great data on what appeared to be a gap in what families with infants and toddlers could receive. And it didn't really tell us which policies and practice changes states and communities could consider implementing to help address this gap. And that's one reason we created this policy framework. Next slide, please. So just last month, we released our ITCP framework. And in addition to the surveys I just mentioned, other areas that informed our development of this policy framework are, first, we could draw on 0 to 3's expertise in policy and practice at the federal and state level to support young children and their parents. We drew heavily from our lessons learned from 15 plus years of experience of implementing the infant toddler court teams in communities across the country that I mentioned earlier. We looked at best practices and research, and we drew from our key partners and practitioners in the field. Next slide, please. So our goal with this report is to provide state and local policymakers, agency directors, and other state and community leaders with a menu of policy options related to the systems of supports available for families with very young children. And we know from the research that child welfare systems sometimes adopt a one-size-fits-all approach for all age groups of children that is not always responsive to the developmental needs of infants and toddlers. And a few points I want to make about how to use this report. We don't expect that a state would take on implementing every one of the policies that are put forth in our report, but rather that these would serve as a menu of options and best practices from which a state could go through and identify opportunities that align with the goals and vision of the state or the community. And I also want to note that the policy strategies that we put forth are not necessarily just legislative solutions, but rather new approaches or changes that could happen at the state agency level or community level. And these policies can lay a groundwork for helping children and families thrive. Next slide, please. And building off of that, I just wanted to note that this policy framework is not just for child welfare agencies. Many and most of the recommendations in here cut across agencies serving families. So early care and education, health, mental health, substance use, economic security, just to name a few. And we hope that this report is also useful for community members, parents, and families. Next slide, please. So this report is comprised of two sections. So this first section, section 1, focuses on providing a continuum of supports and services to families who need assistance. So this would be what we consider primary and secondary prevention services that can support the healthy development of infants and toddlers and their families. So this section really highlights that good health, secure and stable families and positive early learning environments are important to ensuring children's development during this significant period. And when infants and toddlers and parents have supports and skills that they need to succeed from the beginning, families are stronger and more stable, ideally leading to more productive communities and empowering a future workforce. Next slide, please. So within this section 1, 4 policies fall here. And the program's policies and supports in this section would ideally be made available through a 2-generation approach. So to children, as well as their parents and other caregivers who can benefit from them. And we would hope that families can access this continuum of services without ever having to encounter the child welfare system, unless there's a significant safety concern for the child. And in this report, we propose that rather than leading the efforts, that the child welfare system and agencies across the country can be an important partner with other early childhood entities, providing insights into the services that families may need. And in this section, we also talk about the importance of good health, including physical and mental health, and also good nutrition, maternal health care, and pediatric care. Next slide, please. So section 2 of the report focuses on tertiary prevention. So that would include services and supports for families with infants and toddlers who have an open child welfare case, or who are either placed in out-of-home care or remaining at home, but still with an open case. And you may remember from the poll question earlier that the number of infants entering foster care accounted for more than 70% of the total increase of entries of all ages during that period. And why is that important? Well, in this section 2, policies are centered around the research that maintaining relationships with a trusted caregiver is critical for children's health and well-being, and that removing a child from their parents can inflict and or increase trauma for children and their families. There's a growing body of research that early identification of needs and services for young children can improve child safety and well-being and strengthen families. Next slide, please. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the policies in this section. So some examples of the policies are adopting practices that are attuned to the development of infants and toddlers, access to timely screening and assessments, high quality legal services for children and parents and others. And just to give you an example, so policy 5 talks about the importance of embedding principles of early childhood development into all systems. So some strategies that would be included in the report for this policy include training and ongoing coaching of staff that interact with young children, such as attorneys, judges, early childhood educators, health professionals, on important topics, including the science of brain development, infant mental health, and the impacts of trauma. And another sort of those menu of options that might be included under this policy would be examining child welfare processes, including frequency of court reviews or visitation between parents and children to see how they're meeting the developmental needs of babies. Next slide, please. And some strategies around in this section could include family team meetings, other types of teaming models that can be used to provide individual services to meet the needs of babies. So just to give you sort of an idea of what would be included here. And I included a few screenshots as examples. So the report is set up so that each policy has the same section, so a reader can flip through and read about the size and scope of the challenge, opportunity for change, research, and then of course the recommended state and local strategies, which are those menu of options that I had talked about. Next slide, just to show you a few screenshots. This report also includes over 40 state and local examples, as well as an appendix at the end of the report, so that states and localities, anyone reading the report can learn more about how states have carried out these changes in policy or practice, and also contact information so you can reach out and learn more from the state or community. Next slide.
Hey, Lindsay, I just want to jump in and mention we're starting to run a little short on time. So if you can move to wrap so we can hear from Lindsay, if that's okay.
Yes.
Perfect.
I'm
Thank you so much.
almost finished. Yes, thank you. We have key data in each section to be able to measure system strengths and gaps using data. Next slide, please. And also a key resources in each section. You can go to the next slide and I'll wrap up. Thank you. So with that, I want to have the website up again for you all. And just mention we also have a key resource released last year, our federal funding guide, which provides a detailed overview of 30 federal funding sources relevant to families with young children, provides analysis in different areas, and it could be a helpful tool for all of you. And we've also included more about our core team approach and the contact information for our program director. And with that, I want to turn it over to Lindsay, our parent leader with the ITCP. Lindsay's from Iowa and is the mother to an amazing little boy. And she worked closely with Project Iowa and Children and Families of Iowa, and will talk to us about the importance of a child welfare system that is informed by parents.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Lindsay Calvary, and I currently serve as a parent leader with 0 to 3. I am a mother to a very spunky little boy named Gabriel, and we all lived a very blessed life today, which I owe all to recovery and a system that didn't give up on me. I'm very well versed in much of the material within the policies framework. I became DHS involved when my son tested positive at birth. My case was open for 3 long years, during which I experienced many struggles such as domestic violence, relapse, and having my son placed in foster care. Reading this report, I can relate to many of the policies it refers to. There were many services I was fortunate enough to receive, and I can attest to their successes personally. It is not just a report to me, though. This is a document containing the reasons that I am alive today. When I think about what this contains, I realize that without all of these factors that could or could not have been offered to me, I may not be here today. I first want to talk about frequent high quality family time with parents and siblings. This is one of the policies I have to address first and foremost. Addiction is this awful, terrible disease, and I fought tooth and nail against every instinct inside of me. I had to tell myself, just get through the next hour without using, or sometimes just get through the next 15 minutes without using in order to get through most days. It is going against our physical makeup to abstain, yet we do it, eventually for ourselves, but in reality, it begins with doing it for our kids. Now take away that bond, that reminder of what is important to you, and replace it with the desperate need to numb it away, and you have a failed system. Parents and children alike need this bond to survive. Increased visits are a necessity. When my son went into foster care, he was not even 2 years old. Those few hours we got together during that time were the reason that I kept existing. It is this primal need, and I assure you success will not be found if this is not kept regularly. Secondly, it's imperative to have the care needed to treat substance use disorder. And the first policy discusses medical coverage for the families in need. I participated in substance use treatment for the entire 3 years I was DHS involved, and there were many sessions I was unable to attend due to the cost of these services. I was very fortunate in having amazing providers who went over and beyond to find funding and grants to assist me. But if we're talking about the scope of saving a family, this should never be necessary. I participated in child parent psychotherapy, substance use therapy, as well as EMDR, and these were some of the biggest deciding factors in my long-term sobriety. Where would I be today if that financial roadblock for insurance would have dissuaded me? Another policy, early intervention services for children, as outlined in the policy 3, has also changed my life dramatically, especially regarding exposure to substances. I used during my pregnancy. It is still one of my biggest regrets and points of shame, but I share this because my son has special needs, very likely due to my use. My son needed early intervention. When he was not hitting milestones in his development and his behaviors were manifesting as irregular, I needed to learn how to help him. I was introduced to early access as well as the STAR Clinic here in Iowa, which monitors children developmentally throughout their life. Gabriel has been attending this clinic every 6 months since he was born, and they were able to refer me out for testing needed, as well as refer me to therapies we utilize still to this day. Being a parent is hard. Being a parent in recovery is harder. Being a parent in recovery to a child with special needs is nearly impossible. I cannot stress the importance of these services enough. Early access, safe care, early Head Start were all crucial in teaching me how to help Gabriel and ultimately become a safer and more engaged parent. This year, my son graduated from preschool, and it was the first year ever that he has tested on target developmentally in all areas. So with work and early intervention, these delays do not have to hold him back. Policies 8 and 9 touch on needing more frequent court hearings and the use of frequent family team meetings. And I can attest to the necessity. I was struggling with relapse in my first year of the case. I was attending substance use treatment, but I saw my judge once every 6 months. So the accountability just wasn't there. After entering family court with more frequent hearings, as well as structured guidelines for recommended treatments, meetings, etc., it was actually teaching me how to start learning how to function as a normal adult. This structure not only provided me with the accountability I needed, but also I felt seen by the judge and not just a number on a docket. In my family team meetings, we addressed anything and everything to do with my recovery, my son, and the roadmap to reunification. It became this safe space to learn how to voice my family's needs, our wins and our fails. It was ultimately these meetings that allowed me to come forward about the domestic violence I was facing. This would not have been possible if that trust had not been built. It took me 2 years into my case to vocalize this, but in the end, it saved my life. Obviously, I'm an advocate of providing parent mentors and parent partners. When it comes to recovery, as quoted in Narcotics Anonymous literature, therapeutic value of one addict helping another is unparalleled. Coming into the child welfare system is traumatic and terrifying. There is an acronym for everything, and terms like adjudication are being thrown around, and all you know is that you would do anything to be with your child again. The child welfare system is the most foreign and devastating process in the beginning. Coming into the system, I just felt like everyone was judging me and I trusted no one. There are so many positives to a parent mentor program. Parent mentors can provide not only guidance within a very confusing system, but the support needed to get through the hardest days of your life. In my eyes, this framework isn't just a bunch of policies. It is the keys to saving lives. I can go through each and every one of these policies and tell you how my recovery would not have been complete if even a couple of these were omitted. There are so many families in need of this, and if we can consistently deliver this message across the nation, you will be saving lives. Lives like mine and Gabriel's. Thank you so much for having me here today, and I'll turn it back over to Jenna.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers for sharing the data, the framework and survey responses, and for our parent leader for sharing your personal experience with this. Now we are going to move into the question and answer portion. We are going to formally wrap this at once, so we're possibly not able to get to every question, but we are, NCSL staff and the experts will stay on the line, 1 p.m. Mountain Time, 3 p.m. Eastern. We are going to stay on the line after the formal wrap up, so you can continue to ask your questions or share as you would need to. So don't worry, if you've got time, we'll stay on. And so the first couple of questions that came through earlier from Kim's presentation, I see that Kim was able to answer the question about the child tax credit in the chat box. So please refer to her answer there. We did get a second question from Senator Claire Wilson about the data on reunification and adoption. Kim, could you just share whether in this set, the adoption is within the extended family unit or outside?
I was curious with the slide because you talked about guardian and such, but I was surprised that reunification was first and then adoption was second. And I don't know whether that's kinship or whether that is outside family system, because you also had guardian, and I think there was another category as well.
Right, and thank you for your question, Senator. The other category was relative, which would include kinship care. If I'm understanding the question correctly, so the adoptions would be outside of the family unit and not with a relative family member.
And I just have to say that surprises me that we would not have kinship care and family, what we know about attachment and what we know about young people as they grow, that we would remove a child as opposed to placing them first and foremost within their family context. So thank you for, yeah, wow, thanks.
For the question, I appreciate that. And you might also look at our national profile on the website. I think, I can't remember offhand, but I think that there may be some more subgroup data around that too, which might lend a little bit more perspective on that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we also received a question from Senator Faust-Trudeau about what the research shows is the reason for the high percentage of children under 3 going into state custody. So either Kim or Jacqueline, if you'd like to answer this question.
I can answer that. Thank you. So that's a really good question. Thank you. And so the report that I mentioned from HHS, who compiles the state data and puts out the national report on foster care entry, has showed that entry rates increased by a pretty high percent in the most recent years that the data is available, from 2011 to 2018. And what's interesting is there were some counties that the report, I believe, called high growth contributors in certain states that led that infant entry rate to be substantially higher across the country than other age groups. There are a wide range of factors that can be contributing to this high increase. There's risk factors related to infant safety, but then there's a lot of systematic factors related to policies and practices of state child welfare agencies, of how of what constitutes neglect. And neglect is one of the highest reasons for entry into foster care, but states all have different definitions of what constitutes neglect. And also plans of safe care, in which some states require reporting of prenatal substance exposure. Others have different policies and practices around that. But I know the findings nationally and put out by HHS are that further work and research in the field is really needed to identify those specific factors that are contributing to the trends in foster care entry.
Thank you. And then we have one final question before we wrap up and then come back from Ashlyn Brennan. So which states, if any, have most successfully implemented any of these policy suggestions from what you have seen in your data and research that the fellows can maybe take a closer look at to see if it fits for their state? I think this question would be for Jacqueline, but also, Kim, if you have seen any in the yearbook data as well.
Could you repeat the question real quickly?
Oh, I'm sorry. And I know we're running short on time, and so we might give you a few moments to think about it too and share after, and we're also happy to share it out with the rest of the group because it might be difficult to come up with it on the spot. But the question is about whether there are states that have successfully implemented these policy options in the framework that the fellows can take a look at as examples.
Right. I think
Yes.
more Jacqueline.
I'm sorry. Thank you for repeating that. My computer just froze right when you were talking, so I appreciate it. So within the framework, we have state and local examples within each of the policies, and then an appendix at the end, sort of by policy area, where we have state and community best practices examples, kind of how they were able to implement some of these changes. We don't necessarily have examples of states that are kind of leading across all the areas. We didn't do any state ratings or anything like that, but we tried to collect a good grouping of state and local examples. But it is an area that we are looking at doing even more research into, to sort of find states that have best been able to create this continuum and kind of services and to create these family strengthening systems.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'll hand it over to Allison to just wrap it up. But of course, we're staying on the line.
Thank you, everyone, so much. Can you see the screen in front of you? Good, excellent. So we did this, we talked, we heard great questions. We're going to keep talking. So as any good NCSL meeting, we really do want to hear from you. So Kind is going to drop, or did drop in the chat, a URL. Take 2 minutes, please, a minute and a half. Tell us what you thought about this session. It really does help us to plan for future events. We'll also send this electronically if you'd like. And as you all know, our next Fellows event is going to be on the 18th of August. It's going to be joint actually with Child Welfare, Early Childhood, and our Youth Homelessness Fellows. And during that Zoom convening, we are going to talk about protective factors. And we're going to hear from a woman named Francie Zimmerman. She works at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. So be sure to register and add that to your calendar. And I know we've been saying it, I've been saying it for a while, that information's coming about our September meeting in Denver, and it is hopefully very early next week. We're just making sure that everyone will be able to buy their ticket when we send the invite language. So stand by, you will have information early next week about booking travel and getting ready to come to Denver. And I'm in Denver, and we'll be sure to queue up some fantastic weather when you all come in September to visit us. So with that, if you are going to be in Denver for Summit the first week in August, let me know. I'll be there. I know a few of you that are on the line right now. I'm looking at you in particular, Rep. Timoney, because I saw your name the other day. Let us know when you're in Denver. Would love to see you. And thank you. Thank you all for being here, and do feel free to stay on the line right now. We know some people have to get off the line. We're already 2 minutes over, but like we said, our experts from 0 to 3 will stay here. We'll take the slides down and we can just talk in smaller group. Oh, and I'll stop recording so we can talk in smaller group.